Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is John Giordano from the Center for Economic Growth staff. Thank you for attending our webinar series this morning. And if you were here to listen to Kurt Jaeger and Tom Healy of Jaeger and Flynn, you're in the right spot. So I am happy to introduce these two gentlemen to you and their company. They have offices in Clifton Park, Saratoga, and Glens Falls. They have over 600 business clients. They offer insured and self-insured health and dental insurance, employee benefits, HR consulting, wellness program support, property and casualty insurance, consumer-driven healthcare accounts, COBRA, retiree, and basically everything on the menu that you could desire. We have a special relationship with this organization when corporations in the area are looking for consultative information and services in these areas. So without further, I just want to remind you that at the bottom of your toolbar on your screen, you'll see a Q&A section. It is okay at any point during the session to type in any questions that you have, and we will be sure that Kurt and Tom see them and hear them and get you an answer. So without further ado, please, Kurt and Tom, take over.
Okay, thanks, John. And I want to just send out a big thank you to the CEG for inviting Jaeger and Flynn Associates to work with the CEG and putting together this brief webinar. Tom Healy, he is the Senior Account Executive and Director of Product Development here at Jaeger and Flynn Associates. And I'm Kurt Jaeger. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Marketing Officer. Today's presentation is going to be a high-level presentation around alternative funding. It's a high-level presentation due to the broad range of participants on the webinar, from small businesses up to very large corporations as well. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tom Healy. He's going to start out with the presentation, and then about halfway through, I'll be handling the second half of the presentation. So Tom?
All right. Thanks, Kurt. So good morning, everybody. Hopefully everybody's hanging in there with these unusual times. Hopefully everybody's employees and families and yourselves are safe. So, new way of doing business, new way of communicating information out there everybody's trying to get used to. So, as Kurt mentioned, we want to talk a little bit about alternative funding. All right, so it's really about medical financing, not necessarily anything that has to do with employee benefits changing co-pays and benefit structures, but how an employer actually finances the plan. I guess right out of the gate, there's a majority of employers are fully insuring their program. So they're paying a carrier fully insured premiums in order for them to assume the responsibility of paying claims. And what we find out there talking to employers, there's a lot of frustration. And, we've labeled it here in the presentation that it's a problem, and it's a reoccurring problem because it's a lot of frustration. Typically, an employer goes into a fully insured renewal trying to figure out, that problem and how to react to that problem for the next 12 months until it's time for it to appear again. What they typically do is they change deductibles, they change employer contributions, and sometimes they even disrupt the entire plan just to run away or try and address that fully insured increase. And what we have to recognize is that, again, it's a short-term strategy in order to address the affordability of what is a major tool to attract and retain employees. When we look and we break down the components and how a carrier develops actual premiums during the renewal, we have to recognize carriers are looking at past claim utilization to set future premiums. In addition to that, what they're doing is they're putting a percentage, they're applying a percentage of that premium associated to premium taxes that they're responsible for, assessments that, whether it be state or federal governments are passing on to employers, also profits and margins. So, one thing that I want to get across is that that overhead that carrier is responsible for, the margins, profit, and taxes, become a fixed percentage of premium. All right, so I guess I'm going to ask a rhetorical question out there just to somewhat provoke some thought. If in fact that carrier is charging a percentage of premium for that overhead, for the margins and for the profits, really what incentive does that carrier have to reduce that medical premium cost? Again, rhetorical question, provokes some thought. We have to recognize that, if claims become the basis of future premiums, claims will typically fluctuate from year to year. I think most of you have probably seen it. There are good years and bad years. And the question becomes, is what happens in those favorable years when claims are low? Who's profiting from, that favorable claim year? Lastly, when we look at, the interest of alternative funding, and I guess it's really started back in 2010 with the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, with the assessments and the costs associated to it. There's been a lot of interest out there in the marketplace. However, employers are somewhat fearful because of the perceived risks associated with it. All right, one of the things that our objective is today, and Kurt's going to go through it, is just to help educate the group on this call today to recognize that there are different strategies towards financing your medical insurance, and that perceived concern of risk really can be diminished depending on the strategy. So, we move on to, what we see as a solution, and this is really where Kurt and I are going to focus in on mostly today, is we really do believe that there needs to be a mechanism for an employer to save in those years when claims are running favorably. In addition, what I meant to say is that the basis of that, all right, so how do we go ahead and get to the point where we can save in those favorable years, is that each of these concepts that we're going to explain today makes a very sound assumption, or a very consistent assumption, that it is wise to go ahead and develop a mechanism to self-insure those smaller predictable claims throughout the year. We're talking about the office visits, x-rays, MRIs, things that we pretty much expect employees are going to incur throughout the year. But while we create that mechanism to fund those smaller claims, we have to put those safeguards in place to ensure the large unpredictable claims, to pass that risk over onto the insurance carrier. All right, once we develop, these two mechanisms, the smaller claims and passing off the risk over to a carrier on the larger claims, this whole renewal process begins to change. All right, what we've done is we've actually shrunk the premiums that we're paying to the carriers. So it's only a fraction of the overall cost as compared to 100% of the cost. And in addition to that, when in fact you have a favorable claims year, those profits are going into the employer's pocket as compared to the employees. All right, so we're going to mainly talk about 4 financing concepts. All right, again, medical financing concepts. Now, there are others out there, such as, you may have heard of a minimum premium plan or a level funding, but just for the sake of time and for this presentation, we've narrowed the alternative strategies down into 3: deductible funding, self-insured group captive, and your self-insured traditional ASO. We put this picture together, I think is a pretty effective picture, because a lot of people associate, risk versus reward when they're speaking about investment choices, right? So the investment advisor sits with us and going, okay, if you're willing to take a little more risk in that portfolio, you do have the opportunity for greater financial reward. And I guess we can use that analogy here with medical financing. So over on the vertical axis, you have risk, all right, and that's really associated to volatility, claims volatility. What am I going to be responsible in the self-insured market? What exposure do I have financially? And then over on the horizontal axis, we have, reward, All right, so what are the opportunities for me as an employer when I'm using one of these strategies to go ahead and gain some financial savings? You know, so at the far end of the spectrum here, you know, fully insured, low risk, you're passing 100% over onto the insurance carrier, but in turn is really, you know, low reward at the same time. On the other end of the spectrum, you have that traditional self-insured program. Again, you know, we're probably looking at an employer that's larger in size. You know, here in New York, you need at least 100 full-time equivalents to get over into this right side of the profile. However, those employers under 100 lives still have the opportunity of deductible funding, where is Kurt's going to actually start. All right, but again, it just kind of gives you a picture, a different way to finance a medical program, each with their own characteristics and protections, and what really would match your corporate culture when it comes to managing risk. All right, so just to kind of level set here a little bit, just talking about fully insured, and again, recognizing that, you know, the majority of the employers out there, smaller to mid-sized employers, let's call it less than 500 employees, many of them do fully insure their program. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. However, again, for the purpose of this conversation, we want to educate and make you aware that there are protections on the self-insured market and giving you mechanisms for savings. But, you know, let's just take a look at the fully insured. What are the pros? You know, if there was that Staples Easy button, it probably belongs on this slide, because really the carrier sets your premium, an employer pays the premium, and in turn, you know, the carrier pays all the claims. They're making all the decisions for you. You know, what the programs are, you're subject to state mandates. Again, it's a one-size-fits-all, easy type of button. On the flip side of it, though, when we're looking at the cons, again, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, you know, the high tax load. So this is a percentage of premium that insurance carrier is applying to 100% of the premium. Same thing with the profits. And also, you know, any of the other overhead pieces of the overall premium puzzle becomes a flat percentage applied to the premium. You know, there's a lack of controls, you know, so again, they're making the decisions, the carrier, on what the plan design options are. And from a data perspective, they're deciding really what that fully insured employer sees as far as reporting. And it's usually 12 months behind you. You know, as Kurt's going to mention a little bit on his slides, you know, through this alternative funding mechanism, that access to data, real-time data, actually increases as you move into a different mechanism to funding your healthcare. You know, and then lastly, prescription drug. You know, we've seen it out there in the news. You know, the cost of specialty drugs, the cost of prescriptions have been increasing. And again, under a fully insured program, that insurance carrier is actually making the decision which PBM is being placed on their products. And so again, the question becomes, what are the relationships behind the scenes between that carrier and the PBM? And really, one of the challenges we have in a fully insured product is the lack of transparency. All right, so, you know, this is an important concept to understand, and it's mainly for the larger employers that are on the call, over 100 employees, because those are the ones that are going to be experience rated by that fully insured medical carrier. It's a really important concept because claims are the starting point. The previous year claims are the starting point of that carrier's medical premiums in the future. All right, so in another way of saying it, it's really a retrospective look on claims to set a prospective premium into the future. As this slide indicates, yet another way of saying it, those claims that an employer is experiencing today are not necessarily insured, but instead they're deferred to next year because, again, it's the basis of the premium. right? Not only does the carrier look at last year's claims, right? However, when they're building in the premium and using those claims to build the premium for that second year, they're adding what's called medical trend. And I suspect most of you on the call today are familiar with that term. It's really the carrier's way of recognizing and pricing for, hey, the claims took place yesterday, I have to price for them tomorrow, so therefore I have to add an inflationary component to it. On average, carriers use about 9%. All right, so again, we're using last year's claims inflated by 9%. Again, what the carrier's perception is on what their obligation to pay claims in the coming year. You know, again, with this in mind, under a fully insured approach, what happens in a year, all right, when there's fewer claims than that carrier was expecting? All right, on this next slide, we're going to show you the impact of that. All right, a lot of lines on it, but you know, I think once I walk you through it, you'll understand. Blue line here, all right, this is the line that's representing the fully insured premium level, all right, over this 9-10 year period. The orange line are the paid claims over the same period of time. And this is illustrative, all right, but we're just showing the concept of the importance of having a mechanism to save in those favorable claim years. All right, so this employer is actually paying $1 million in year one of premium. And over the course of the 10-year period, as you know, I mentioned a little bit earlier, the expectation is that claims experience is going to go up and down over this 10-year period. Well, in 2001, right here, things were going pretty well, pretty flat as far as claims are concerned. But what happens in 2021, we have a spike in claims. And the medical claims actually exceed the premium being charged by the carrier. You know, again, many of you may relate on your own plans. You know, it's just a matter of having 2 or 3 high-cost claimants on the plan that can change this equation and throw that loss ratio the medical carrier is keeping track of off track. All right, but after this loss ratio that jumped through the roof, the claims actually exceeded premiums, what does the carrier do? They react and they increase the medical premium. Now, in the meantime, what happens is claims came down to a more normal level. All right, so it was a 1-year aberration that took place. But again, because of this concept that claims are deferred, not necessarily insured, your premium basis has actually increased. So when claims have now come down, the profit that the carrier is putting in their pocket of $350,000 is actually lost opportunity for that employer. All right, similar situation takes place down here in year 8, where actually the gap was $516,000. But again, you know, this is an example that's illustrative that hopefully just grabs your attention on the concept that, you know, the claims are actually deferred and the importance of having a mechanism for you as the employer to save financially and when claims are running well. So, you know, we sit there and say, okay, wait, all right, I get that. You know, some of these concepts are making sense to me, so what do I do now? And, you know, Kurt and I, we're pretty passionate about these concepts. We have a lot of talk internally in the office, arguments back and forth. And, you know, what it comes down to is just we need the employer to change the mindset. You know, it's that employer that's willing to change the mindset, all right, that has the opportunity to avoid that annual reaction to the problem, and have a savings mechanism that's actually should be viewed on a long term. So this chart kind of gives you the perspective and where we're trying to go with this to help that employer visualize the price of that 1-year reaction as compared to a broader perspective, looking at a more strategic approach over a 10-year period. So this is just, again, a fictitious employer that has about a $1.5 million medical premium spend. And what this chart does is it just makes the assumption of an average trend increase that a medical carrier is going to assign to that fully insured renewal each year. So you can see over the course of 10 years, all right, that employer is actually going to be paying about just less than $23 million in fully insured medical premium.
I'm not sure I understand.
And so the change in mindset is that we want to create, that mechanism that I've mentioned, that in those good years, all right, that I have a mechanism to put those savings in my pocket. I want to be able to reduce the percentage of taxes and profit and margin that I'm paying to an insurance carrier. So just with those very simple assumptions and, not a high reach, as far as being able to develop a 5% savings mechanism each year in an alternative funding mechanism, right? What that means over a 10-year period is taking about $3.5 million out of that employer's medical insurance spend. Again, we're not talking about changing the benefits of the employees. We're talking about just a different way of financing, all right, the medical program to gain greater financial efficiency. All right, so that kind of sets up, the alternatives that Kurt's going to go through. He's going to go through the three that we saw are on the spectrum, and each of them are going to have different characteristics, risk versus reward, and the types of protections that are available out there that many times employers don't recognize that you do have access where you can have an alternative funding program with a fully insured protections. All right, Kurt, I'll pass it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I appreciate you setting that up. What we're going to do is we're going to start with the deductible funding of the three funding concepts. We're going to kind of go back to a strategy that works very, very well for employer groups in the 2 to 100 market, but a lot of larger employers utilize this over the years as well. But it is a great concept in the small group market for that 2 to 100. I'll explain why. Employer groups of all sizes are looking to have high quality benefits. They're looking to offer them at a low cost point. And as Tom said in the beginning of the presentation, they want to try to be able to achieve this without benefit reductions. So this is a strategy that allows you to do that. It kind of goes along with, hey, what can smaller employers do to pay for those smaller claims? What can they do to begin to self-insure to a certain degree without adding a lot of risk to their program? And deductible funding strategy does that. It's a concept where you're purchasing a higher deductible, but you're doing it at a lower premium. So if you're doing it at a lower premium, in essence, you're paying lower in all those taxes and fees and margin expenses that Tom was talking about earlier. So it definitely lowers that tax and profit load, which is that first bullet in a pro for a alternative deductible funding type of strategy. So those day-to-day claims, actually, if you're paying them, you actually get to have some reporting on it. So you can see what those spends are like. And over a period of time, what we've known, we've been doing this strategy for probably 15 years now for a large majority of the clients that we work with, is that the data actually becomes very, very relevant for each of those groups, and they consistently run at the same numbers year in and year out. So you can begin to weigh your risk and see the benefits of it. So understanding that front-end utilization is extremely key for groups. And once again, it introduces an element of cost savings. You're able to manage the program going forward based on the utilization that you're receiving and the data that you're looking at. And you can actually tell, well, maybe this year we could purchase an even higher deductible and still keep our employee benefits, in terms of their actual employee cost share right where it is, because we're just going to self-insure the difference of that deductible. So we keep our employees whole. The bad side of these programs is you still lack control. You're still purchasing the program from the carrier. You don't have a lot of alternatives. You're kind of buying the program from them off the shelf of what they filed with the state. So there's not a lot of adjustments outside of changing the deductibles that you can voluntarily put in place. outside of the other claims that you're insuring, you're still blind. There's a lack of data. Groups of less than 100 don't receive any data. You have no idea where your claim spend is. Over 100, you start to receive more data. Once you get to a point where you're credible, 100% credible, you receive extremely good data. But in that less than 100 market, there is no data. So the data that you pick up would be the part that you're self-insuring on the front end for those smaller claims. You're still dealing with fully insured trends here in this segment. The carriers themselves typically looking at 8 to 10% trend. So if your group's running really well and you're running at a 2 or 3% trend, you're forced to pay that 8 to 10% trend in this particular model. Tom mentioned this earlier. In any fully insured case, you're stuck with the carrier's PBM. There's little that you can do to negotiate. Actually, there's nothing you can do to negotiate the contract. You won't receive any rebate revenue, etc. And one downside to this as well is the employee submission for reimbursement. Unless like ourselves, we have an electronic platform. So the employer groups we work with, we do electronic submission, and the employees don't have the out-of-pocket. But most models that we see out there, they have an out-of-pocket and they have to submit and get reimbursed, and there's a lot of paperwork involved. So that's definitely perceived as a negative. So on our next slide, we're going to talk about self-insuring. And before we discuss the concept in depth, I just want to give everybody a little bit of basic knowledge about self-insurance. It's important to have a little bit of a knowledge base as we go through these next few slides. The first most important thing that you have to realize is that if you begin to work towards becoming a self-funded type of group outside of deductible funding, you have to realize that you don't have to take on 100% of the risk. There are protections that can be put in place, and typically almost 100% of the time are put in place unless you're one of these groups that are 25, 30, 40, 50,000 employees where you basically taking total risk on. But in the market segment that serves this area, typically in that 100 to 5,000 population, you are going to put some protections in place. You're going to put in a specific stop loss and an aggregate stop loss. And what a specific stop loss does is gives you protection on an individual basis. I'll give you an example, and depending on your group size, you could buy anywhere from a $30,000 specific stop loss level up to $250, $300, $500, depending on group size. But let's just stay down on the smaller side for a second here to understand the concept. With specific stop loss, let's say we're buying a $30,000 specific. That means any claimant, so any member that has a claim that goes over $30,000, it's reinsured. So you're not taking on that risk. Goes along with what Tom was saying earlier, that, hey, self-insure the smaller claims. But what you want to do is you want to buy insurance protection for the larger claims. And if you stick with that model over a long period of time, say a 10-year period, you will win from what we see in the data. So that specific stop loss protects you up to that certain level, and then it gets reinsured. But then what we do is we also purchase a aggregate stop loss. And on the aggregate stop loss side, typically what we're doing is insuring you for protection that's 125% of your expected claims. So if your expected claims were $1 million, we're saying that to a group that you would never have any more risk than $1,250,000. So you have protection on an individual level, and you have a protection on an aggregate level. Those of you that have looked at self-insurance, there's a lot of agents out there or consultants that believe, hey, you might want to go without the aggregate. You very rarely ever see an aggregate hit, which is true. And we can say that we've never seen an aggregate hit on our end. But that aggregate protection, that 125% of expected, that's your sleep at night insurance. And it's not super expensive. And it is a protection that we recommend that self-insured groups would put in place. So as we move on, We'll talk about what I feel is the single largest risk is self-insuring. And I refer to it as a dirty little word called lasers. And lasers are an extremely important um, uh, topic that you need to understand if you self-insure. And basically, the strategy that's used by the insurance carriers, the stop loss carriers, to mitigate their risk on you. I'll give you an example. You can all read what I've written here, but I'll just verbalize it for you. So what a laser is when you enter into a stop loss contract with a particular carrier. Say you go into it and you're healthy, and they issue a specific stop loss of $100,000 limit. And you go through the year and you have an employee that has maybe a lung cancer and needs a transplant. So as you go through that year, that employee ran up $200,000 of bills. But that year, as we stated, your stop loss for any individual is $100,000. So after that employee hit the $100,000 limit, that employee is reinsured through stop loss. The carrier or the employer group no longer pays claims on that individual. But as we go through renewal and enter into year 2, the carrier, when they're negotiating that stop loss renewal, will come back and say, hey, we know that this individual is going to have a lung transplant, and because of that, we know that cost is going to be $300,000. What we're going to do is we're going to continue to individually provide protection for all of your members on your group at that $100,000 level we did last year, except for this individual. For this individual, we're going to laser them at $300,000 because it's a known cost. So that's the scary part. So now on that individual, that employer group is responsible for the first $300,000 of claims on that individual. Still only 100 on everybody else, but that known claim at 300. Now, when lasers come out, we can sometimes negotiate them out. We have the claims and the data analytics and the medical notes to fight on. Sometimes we're very successful with that. Sometimes we're not. And the carriers will say, nope, that's the laser. So that's the single largest risk in our opinion, because what if it's $1 million laser? Well, now you're on the hook for the $1 million. So we talk about lasers and you talk about self-insurance. The next thing you want to know is, well, how would I mitigate that laser? How would I reduce that or completely eliminate the lasers from that? Because all the other things that Tom Healy talked about earlier in the presentation, those sounded great. I would love to get rid of the state premium taxes. I would love to pay lower margin. I would love to pay lower trend. I would love to, get rid of some of the mandates in the program. That alone would save us, 5 to 7% right there. But I don't want to do that because I'm very nervous about these lasers. So as we move into the next slide, we'll talk about one of the ways that we can mitigate lasers or completely eliminate them. When we talk about ways to do this, a great concept that we feel is really good in that 100 to 500 employee size segment is a group captive. Give you a little bit of characteristics about a captive. They're less volatile than being insured in a self-funded world by yourself. Basically, what you're getting when you buy into a group captive is you're getting economies of scale. You're purchasing stop loss with a number of different businesses. It could be 200 different employer groups purchasing stop loss collectively. This gives you an added protection layer. Gives you lower stop loss levels. So maybe if you're out on your own, a carrier wants to offer you $100,000 specific stop loss level for individual members. Well, maybe through the captive, we can get it at a $60,000 or $70,000 level. So you benefit from that. They ban their renewals, and the most important part about a captive is, and the ones that we utilize is, there's no new lasers at renewal. So regardless of that health condition that may happen that year, the stop loss carrier with the captive will not laser you. So now we've completely eliminated that risk, and we've lowered your taxes, and we've lowered your margin and your trends, and insulated you from mandates that come out. So hence, great opportunity to save as an organization, kind of have all the feeling of a fully insured program in those protections, but you're self-funded, and because you're insulated from the single largest threat of self-funding, that laser. And you can see in a group captive, when you look down at the chart there, you'll see that you have stop loss premiums of all employers. And what happens in a captive is if you're profitable, those premiums and savings go back towards the captive. If the stop loss isn't, then the captive subsidizes back towards the stop loss protection. It keeps it balanced. And balance is something that we recommend in any employee benefit medical program, especially in a self-funded plan. You need to have that balance. From a membership type of characteristic, the captives require capital investments. The capital investments, depending on the captive that you go in, is usually 10% of your stop loss premium. But that capital investment works very similar to like a country club bond, where that capital investment goes in. You're part owner now of that captive, and if you leave, that capital investment can come back to you. So there's some extra added layers of protection to or for you with that capital investment. The aggregated profitability and losses, you're sharing in it. As I said, also you're a member employer. You have common objectives with all the other member employers, and you're like-minded employers that are focused in on reducing healthcare costs. You're all benefiting from laser-free renewals, and basically you're also all benefiting from the cost containment programs that are put in place within a captive. And what I love about the captive concept is they don't just let anyone in. They're looking for employers that have good experience, that understand self-insuring, that are going to collectively partner with the other members of the captive and put their heads together to find good alternative cost-sharing ways to reduce healthcare. All right, to continue on with the captive, just some pros and cons. Some of this is a repeat of what I said, but less risk than the regular stop loss programs that are out there because your risk flattens. And I'm going to show you kind of a nice graph here on that in the next slide. But the other thing is the reduction of taxes that we spoke about. You get to choose best-in-class vendor selection. So from a PBM, you benefit from having, us or your consultant set up the contract with them and negotiating a contract with CVS or Optum or Express Scripts, or Magellan, a multitude of different PBMs. So there's a lot of advantages there. It increases your cash flow. You actually receive the rebate revenue versus the carriers on the insurance side getting the rebate revenue. Most employer groups don't realize just how much money the carriers are making off of the pharmacy benefit management contract, off of the Express Scripts or the Magellans or CVS's. That rebate revenue is flowing back to them versus you. And we teach you in this concept how to get it back into your pocket. Once again, the renewals are banded and the no new lasers. Added cost is just that capital investment. You have to understand that. It's on for employer groups that may say, hey, I'd rather go on the ASO end where there's no capital investment. But if you go into that, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, you go towards that direction. Once again, you're taking on more of the risk yourself. You're not sharing it with the other members. Some people look at the sharing the risk reward with members as a negative because maybe they're having really, really great years. They want 100% of that benefit. In this model, you can't get 100% of that benefit, and that's why we listed it as a negative here. It's a negative in that sense, but it can be a positive in the other sense that, okay, I'm willing to give up a little bit of my benefit to feel that extra added layer of protection. Employer engagement, that's, we have that down. We don't have that listed as a con. We feel in the captive model, you want to be an engaged employer, and there's a lot of benefits to being part of that membership. So this kind of gives you an idea of the volatility. So, on the left-hand side here, you see large claim costs that spread over 50 employers. The right-hand side, you see large claim costs, over a single employer. And so you see how volatile it can be on your own, where the stop loss mitigate, or the captive concept mitigates it. I'll use a term that we're all familiar with today. We flatten the risk. We flatten the curve in that captive concept. So you see how it acts as, the captive really acts as a shock absorber with the large claims, flattening that volatility. So for the group captive, we would head into the traditional ASO self-insured type of program. I really feel this is more for employer groups in the 500 plus, 750 plus market, up and above that. The reason, a few years back, we would have said 100 to 300 in the captive. We're kind of swimming upstream a bit now. And one of the reasons that we've kind of swum upstream is basically because of the high cost specialty drug spend that's out there today. And we're seeing increased lasers on those high cost drug spends. And obviously, as I said, in the captive concept, the increase in lasers would be mitigated in the captive concept because there'd be laser-free renewals. So as you go upstream, employer group size, 500, 750 plus, you wouldn't have that captive protection with the laser-free renewals. Now, in this concept, you can get a laser-free renewal, but at what cost with the carrier? And then if it's an ongoing situation, how long will the carrier offer you those laser-free renewals? So you'd be taking on a bit more risk. Now, most groups that go in this direction, or we recommend go in this direction, we look at their financials, and we want to make sure that they can absolutely absorb any of those years where they have high cost claims or lasers within that. You still get all the same pros in this. You have the reduction of taxes, assessments. You get best in class carrier selection. You're picking your PBM, your pharmacy benefit manager. You still get the improved cash flow. Still great data, and that data is important. It's an important piece of what we do to mitigate future risk. We want to see where the claim spend is coming in. We want to understand it, find the gaps in care, and fill those gaps in care. So ultimately, at the end of the day, we can actually reduce your overall claims spend. And that's that's really where it's at. If we can reduce your claim spend, that's going to be the largest impact that you can have on your program. So with that, that kind of concludes our very high level of deductible funding, captive self-insured, and ASO self-insured models. We have, as an organization, several other presentations that we do that really drill down into each of those different concepts. We're happy if employer groups want to reach out and do a deep dive and understand where they may be able to save 15 to 20% on their current spend. And yes, I said 15, 20. That's what we're doing in some of the concepts and the cost containment strategies that we're using, and we've been extremely successful with that. It's hard to believe that there's that kind of money and waste out there in the programs, but there actually really is. And we can do deeper dives. But, we encourage you to stop feeding the problem, as Tom talked about in the beginning. Look for those long-term opportunities and engage and find a solution that's comfortable for your organization at the right risk level. It's important that you reduce those premium dollars that you're paying to the insurance carriers. Stop letting them make the huge profits on you. Put that money back in your pocket. That graph that Tom showed earlier, where over a 10-year period, what a 5% reduction in your healthcare costs can do. I'm here to tell you, absolutely achievable to mitigate your health insurance costs down by 5%. Absolutely achievable. And look at that example, what it did for that one sample employer group that had about 1.5 million to spend. It saved them over $3 million over a 10-year period. That's significant money. And I know we all would like to have that back in our pocket. So you got to find the right mechanism, and you got to find a program that's going to give you, that feeling of the fully insured program, but give you all the savings of a self-funded plan. And there's a multitude of ways to achieve that. So with that said, I want to say thank you, but I definitely would open this up to questions, and Tom can jump back onto it. And if you have questions, we're happy to answer them.
Kurt, I have one question here. Is it easy for a company to find their historical data in order for you to work with them to find where the margins may be and the cost savings areas may be?
So if they're an experience rated group, a large employer now, or a self-funded employer, and I should say that, many groups feel if they're already self-funded that they've already managed the waste out of their programs. We could still show them a multitude of ways that they could continue to find alternative savings within their existing plans. So if a group has data that they've received from carriers or from their existing self-funded programs, yeah, we could work with them to find the opportunities and develop the strategies with our concepts that we actually use today to find that reduction in savings.
Okay, I don't see any more questions noted unless someone wants to type one in. We do want to let everyone know that this session was recorded and will be up on the CEG website for anyone to share with their business associates or staff members if they would like to do a deeper dive. And certainly you can contact Kurt and Tom at Jaeger and Flynn for future connection, or contact our office to put you in touch with them. And we definitely want to thank Kurt and Tom for their knowledge and experience in this area and sharing it with everybody. Please give them a call if you would like to review this for your firm. Thank you, gentlemen.